We need to talk about this.
I've made my decision.
Please reconsider.
It's not that simple.
There are men in this world who build empires with their bare hands, men who wake before the sun and go to bed long after it has set, men who pour every ounce of blood and sweat and sacrifice into creating something that will outlast them, something that carries their name forward into generations they will never live to see. Raymond Calloway was one of those men. He had started with nothing but a broken down truck, $32 in a cracked leather wallet, and a stubbornness that the people who loved him called faith, and the people who feared him called something else entirely. Over 5 decades, he had turned that nothing into a $4 billion empire spanning logistics, commercial real estate, and private equity, a name so respected in American business circles that governors returned his calls on the first ring, and Fortune 500 CEOs made room in their calendars the moment his assistant reached out. But Raymond Calloway had a secret, not the kind of secret that stays folded up neatly in a drawer somewhere, the kind that breathes, the kind that grows, the kind that eventually walks through your front door and sits down at your table, whether you invited it or not. And on a cold Tuesday morning in February, in the wood-paneled study of his Georgia estate, Raymond Calloway finally let that secret into the room. He called 4 people to that study. 3 of them had known his face their entire lives. 1 of them had only seen it in photographs. 3 of them expected to walk out of that room as heirs to one of the largest private fortunes in the American South. 1 of them expected nothing, because that was all he had ever been given. What happened inside that room over the next 2 hours would set off a chain of events so extraordinary, so layered with betrayal and ambition and quiet, grinding resilience, that by the time it was over, nothing about the Calloway name, nothing about wealth, and nothing about what it truly means to earn something would ever look the same again. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened in that study on that cold February morning, you have to go back, not just a few years. You have to go all the way back to where Raymond Calloway began. Because the man who sat behind that mahogany desk, making decisions that would alter 4 lives forever, did not become that man by accident. He became that man through choices, and understanding those choices is the only way to understand why, when he finally looked across that desk at his children, he felt nothing but disappointment in 3 of them, and something far more complicated in the 4th. Raymond was born in 1949 in rural Georgia, the son of a sharecropper who died young and a mother who cleaned houses until her hands cracked and bled every winter. He did not grow up with a trust fund or a network or a last name that opened doors. He grew up watching his mother apologize to people who treated her like furniture. And he made himself one promise before he turned 16. No one would ever look through him the way they looked through her. He dropped out of college after 1 semester, not because he was not smart enough, but because he could not sit still long enough to let someone else determine the pace of his education. He bought that broken-down truck with borrowed money, convinced a local furniture manufacturer in Savannah to give him a delivery contract, and worked 18-hour days for 3 straight years until he had enough capital to buy a second truck, then a third, then a warehouse, then a fleet. By the time he was 35, Calloway Logistics had contracts with 6 major manufacturers across the Southeast. By 45, he had moved into commercial real estate, acquiring undervalued industrial properties in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Memphis. By 55, his private equity arm was writing checks that reshaped entire neighborhoods. Raymond Calloway had done exactly what he promised that cracked-handed woman he would do. He had made it impossible for anyone to look through him. But success, especially the kind that comes at the speed and scale Raymond achieved it, does something to a man's personal life that no amount of money can fix. It creates distance. It trains you to see everything, including your own family, in terms of return on investment. And Raymond, despite all his greatness in the boardroom, was a deeply flawed man at home. He had married his wife, Gloria, in 1976, a sharp and elegant woman from a prominent Atlanta family who had believed in Raymond before almost anyone else did. They had 3 children together: Diane, born in 1978, Preston in 1981, and Carter in 1984. And Raymond had loved them in his way. But his way was the way of a man who equates provision with presence, who believes that because the bills are paid and the schools are elite and the vacations are first class, the job of fathering has been done. It had not been done, not even close. Diane grew up sharp and strategic, the kind of woman who reads a room before she walks fully into it, who knows the leverage point in every negotiation before the other side realizes there is one. She had her father's intelligence and her mother's composure, and unfortunately, neither of their work ethics. She had spent her adult life managing a Callaway-funded interior design firm that had never turned a genuine profit, surviving entirely on her father's contracts and her family name. Preston, the middle child, was charming in the way that people who have never been told no tend to be charming, easy, and magnetic in social situations, devastating in financial ones. He had blown through 2 startup ventures funded entirely by Raymond, both of which had failed spectacularly within 18 months, and was currently drawing a generous salary from a vice president title at Callaway Logistics that required almost nothing of him. Carter, the youngest, was the quietest of the 3, the one who had retreated most completely from any expectation of contribution. A man who at 40 years old still called his father assistant when his personal finances became inconvenient. Raymond had watched all 3 of them for years with a growing unease he could never fully name. He had given them everything he never had, and in doing so, he had accidentally taken from them the one thing that had made him: the hunger. They were soft in places he had been forged hard. They were comfortable in ways that had never produced greatness in anyone. And as his heart condition worsened through the autumn before that February meeting, Raymond Calloway sat alone many nights in that study and asked himself the question that every self-made parent eventually asks: did I ruin them by loving them the wrong way? But there was a 4th child, and that child had never been ruined by anything Raymond gave him, because Raymond had given him almost nothing at all. His name was Elijah Cole. He was 29 years old. He had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in southwest Atlanta with his mother, Renee Cole, a woman who worked the morning shift at a hospital laundry facility and the evening shift at a dry cleaner on Campbellton Road. Renee had met Raymond Calloway in 1993 at a business conference in Atlanta, where she was working the registration desk. Raymond was 44, she was 26. What followed was not a love story exactly, though there were moments inside it that held that kind of weight. It was a relationship conducted quietly, carefully, and always on Raymond's terms, because Raymond was married, and Raymond's reputation was the foundation of his empire, and Raymond was, above all else, a man who managed risk. When Renee became pregnant in 1995, Raymond did not ask her to disappear, but he did not step forward either. He arranged a private financial agreement, a modest monthly payment that kept Elijah fed and clothed without leaving any paper trail that could surface in the wrong conversation. And he stayed away. Not completely, not cruelly, but enough. Enough that Elijah grew up knowing his father's name, knowing his father's face from magazine covers and news segments, knowing that somewhere across the city there was a man worth billions who shared his blood and had chosen, carefully and deliberately, to keep that fact a secret. You might expect that knowledge to break a child, and in some ways it tried. Elijah was not immune to the weight of it. There were years in his adolescence when the anger was so close to the surface that his mother would sometimes reach across the dinner table and hold his hand for no reason at all, just to remind him that someone was there, that he was real, that his existence was not a mistake, even if it had been treated like an inconvenience by the most important man in his world. But Elijah Cole was his mother's son before he was anyone else's, and Renee Cole was the kind of woman who does not let the world's failures become her child's identity. She read to him, she pushed him. She worked those double shifts so that he could go to a decent school, and she told him every single day, in words, and in the example of her own unbreakable life, that who you are is not determined by who claimed you, but by what you choose to build. Elijah listened. He internalized it in the way that children of strong mothers often do, not just as advice but as architecture, as the actual structure of how he moved through the world. By 22, he had worked his way through a state university on scholarship and part-time jobs, graduating with a degree in business logistics, which was either a coincidence or a subconscious inheritance, depending on how you looked at it. By 26, he was working as a mid-level operations manager at a regional freight company in Atlanta, consistently outperforming people above him, quietly building systems that saved the company money they did not know they were losing. He was good at his work in the specific way that people who have never had a safety net are good at things. Completely, because failure was never an option that came with a phone call to a wealthy parent. He read constantly, business strategy, urban economics, negotiation theory, the kinds of books you find dog-eared in the bags of people who are building something in their heads long before they have the resources to build it in the world. He was not bitter, exactly. He had made peace with his circumstances in the way that requires real work. The kind of peace that is not the absence of pain, but the decision to move forward anyway. And he had, to that point, no particular reason to believe that his life was about to change. Then Raymond's assistant called. Not Raymond himself, his assistant. A woman named Patricia, who spoke in the careful, neutral tones of someone trained to deliver information without revealing anything about the person who sent it. She told Elijah that Mr. Calloway would like to meet with him at the family estate in Buckhead on the 14th of February. She gave him an address and a time and said that his attendance was, quote, strongly encouraged. Elijah sat with his phone in his hand for a long time after that call ended. He had waited 29 years for contact that felt like more than a transaction. He was not sure this was it, but he went. The estate sat behind iron gates on 3 acres of manicured land, the kind of property that communicates wealth not through ostentation but through scale, through the quiet declaration of space in a city where space is currency. Elijah drove himself. He wore the best suit he owned, which was not an expensive suit, but was well-pressed and fitted in a way that communicated something about how he carried himself. He was shown into the main entrance by a housekeeper, and then into the study by Patricia herself, who looked at him for just a moment longer than necessary. A look that was not unkind, but was full of information. The look of someone who knows the whole story and is curious to see how the newest character will react to learning it. The study was wood-paneled and book-lined, the desk enormous and old, the kind of furniture that says permanence in a language that money alone cannot buy. And seated around that desk, in leather chairs that probably cost more than Elijah's monthly salary, were 3 people he had never met in person, but whose faces he had known his entire life. Diane, 52, Preston, 49, Carter, 46. They looked at him with varying degrees of confusion and irritation. The expression of people who have been asked to share a room with someone they do not recognize and cannot immediately categorize. And then Raymond Calloway walked in. He was smaller than Elijah had expected. That was always the first thing people said about powerful men when they finally saw them in person. The photographs and the magazine profiles and the television segments had constructed something monumental in Elijah's imagination. And the reality was a 74-year-old man with silver hair and a slight but noticeable decline in his posture, the body beginning to acknowledge what the mind was still refusing to accept. Raymond moved to the chair behind the desk with the practiced deliberateness of a man conserving energy, sat down, and looked at each of the 4 faces in front of him with an expression that Elijah would later describe to his mother as the look of a man who has already made every decision and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. There was no small talk, no softening preamble. Raymond Calloway had not built $4 billion by being comfortable with awkward silences. But he had also not built it by wasting words on people who had not yet earned his time. He reached into the desk drawer and produced 4 envelopes. He placed them on the desk in a row, one in front of each of them, and then he began to talk. He told them about his heart condition, which was further progressed than he had let anyone outside his medical team know. He told them he had perhaps 6 months, more likely 4. He told them he had spent the last 18 months re-examining everything he had built and everything he had chosen, and what he wanted the architecture of his legacy to actually look like when he was gone. He told them he had made some decisions. And then, with no drama, no raised voice, no visible emotion, beyond a jaw that tightened slightly as he spoke, he told Diane and Preston and Carter that he was removing them from his will, not reducing their share, not restructuring the trust, removing them entirely. The Calloway estate, all of it, would go to a charitable foundation focused on economic development in underserved Southern communities, unless one condition was met. The envelopes in front of them contained the details. The room held a silence so complete that Elijah could hear the clock on the mantel. Diane's face went through 5 distinct expressions in about 3 seconds, each one a different stage of a reckoning she had never once prepared for. Preston made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a protest, but somewhere between the two, the sound of a man whose entire internal map has just been redrawn. Carter simply stared at the envelope as if it had said something out loud, and Elijah sat very still, because the envelope in front of him was different from the others, thinner, and he did not know yet whether that was better or worse, Raymond explained. His children, the 3 he had raised in abundance, had been given every advantage he never had, and in his estimation, those advantages had not produced what he had hoped they would produce. He was not angry at them, he said. He was not punishing them. He was, at 74 and with a failing heart, simply being honest, for possibly the first time in his life, about what he saw when he looked at the people his generosity had created. He told them the will he had spent years preparing had been revoked 2 months ago. He told them they were each healthy adults with access to education and contacts and the Calloway name, all of which was worth more than any trust fund if they chose to use it. And that from this moment forward, the question of whether they built something real was entirely up to them. The foundation would hold the estate in trust for 1 year. If any of his children built a verifiably successful enterprise, independently, without drawing on Calloway funds, Raymond's legal team would evaluate the claim, and the will would be amended accordingly. If none of them succeeded, the charitable foundation would receive everything on the 1-year anniversary of his death. Diane stood up before he had finished the last sentence. She said something that Elijah would not repeat to anyone for years. Preston left without opening his envelope. Carter sat for another 20 minutes in silence before quietly walking out. And Elijah remained, because Raymond had looked at him, specifically at him, after the others left and said quietly, "Open yours." Elijah opened the envelope. Inside was not a legal document. It was a handwritten letter. 2 pages in Raymond's own hand, which was still precise despite everything his body was doing to him. The letter acknowledged, for the first time in writing, that Elijah was Raymond's son. It acknowledged Renee by name, with a respect that was long overdue and clearly felt. It did not ask for forgiveness, because Raymond was too self-aware a man to think forgiveness was his to ask for in a single letter after 29 years. But it said what it needed to say, and then it said something else. It said that Elijah would receive no money from the Calloway estate either. But it said that Raymond would spend whatever time he had left making 3 introductions and offering 1 piece of ongoing counsel, because, in Raymond's estimation, those things, used correctly, were worth more than capital by any measure. The letter ended with 5 words that Elijah read 3 times before he looked up. "Don't waste what I'm giving you." It is worth pausing here to consider the audacity of what Raymond Calloway had just done, because it was audacious. A man with $4 billion telling his children to go make their own money is the kind of story that plays very differently depending on where you are standing. To some people, it sounds like wisdom, like a father who understood that the greatest inheritance he could leave was not a check but a challenge. To others, it sounds like cruelty dressed up in the language of philosophy, like a powerful man who had spent his life making decisions that affected everyone around him and was now making one more. The truth, as it almost always is, was more complicated than either reading. Raymond Calloway was both of those things. He was a visionary and a coward. He was a builder and an absentee. He was a man who understood the value of struggle because he had lived it, and who had simultaneously denied that struggle to the people he claimed to love most, and then resented them for what that denial produced. He was, in other words, profoundly human in the way that only very powerful people can afford to be, with consequences that ripple outward far beyond their own reckoning. But whatever his motivations, the decision had been made. The envelopes had been handed out. And now 4 very different people were walking out of that study into a world that had just shifted entirely beneath their feet. Diane walked out with the controlled fury of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life and has now, finally, been handed a reason to prove every skeptic right. Preston walked out with the defensive confusion of a man who has never been told that the floor beneath him was not solid ground. Carter walked out with the quiet devastation of someone who had secretly known this was coming and had spent years hoping it would not. And Elijah Cole walked out with a handwritten letter, 3 phone numbers, and the specific clarifying terror of a man who has just been handed an opportunity so large and so fragile that a single wrong move could shatter it completely. He sat in his car in the estate driveway for 11 minutes. He knew this because he watched the clock, and then he called his mother. He did not tell her everything, not yet, not over the phone. He told her he had met Raymond. He told her it was real. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the voice that had gotten him through every difficult thing his life had ever handed him, "Come home first, eat something, then we'll talk." He drove back to Southwest Atlanta. He ate the food his mother had kept warm on the stove, and then they sat at the kitchen table where he had done his homework for 18 years, and he told her everything. When he finished, she looked at him for a long time, and then she said, "He gave you the same thing life gave him, the chance to prove it." Elijah nodded. He folded the letter back into its envelope. He put it in his inside jacket pocket, and the next morning he went to work. The 3 phone numbers Raymond had written at the bottom of that letter corresponded to 3 men whose names, if you moved in certain business circles, needed no explanation. The first was Thomas Bridger, 71, a hedge fund manager based in New York who had built a $22 billion fund from a 2-room office in 1987. And whose investment philosophy had been the subject of 2 Harvard Business School case studies and 1 best-selling book. The second was Victor Osi, 63, a Ghanaian-American real estate developer who had immigrated to the United States with less than $200 in 1984 and now controlled a commercial property portfolio worth $900 million across the American South. The third was Franklin Marsh, 68, a former U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce who had spent the last decade advising on public-private infrastructure partnerships across 12 states, and whose Rolodex, as people in his world still called it, contained essentially everyone who mattered in American economic policy. Raymond had arranged for Patricia to send each of them a brief note explaining that a young man named Elijah Cole would be requesting a meeting, and that Raymond considered this young man, quote, worth 30 minutes of your time. That endorsement from Raymond Calloway was not nothing. These were not men who took meetings out of obligation. But Raymond had earned enough respect across enough decades that his recommendation carried real weight, and all 3 of them responded within 48 hours with available windows. Elijah had 3 weeks to prepare. He spent those 3 weeks the way a man prepares for the most important test of his life when he knows the test is real and the consequences of failure are permanent. He read everything he could find about each of the 3 men. He studied their business philosophies, their public interviews, their investment patterns, their stated priorities, and the gap between what they said they cared about and what their actual decisions revealed they cared about. He thought carefully about what he could offer, not just what he needed, because Raymond's letter had included 1 piece of direct advice that Elijah had written on an index card and taped to his bathroom mirror. Never walk into a room asking. Always walk in with something to give. The first meeting was with Thomas Bridger, held at a private members club in Midtown Manhattan, where Elijah was the youngest person in the room by approximately 20 years. He wore the same suit, freshly pressed again, and he arrived 8 minutes early. Bridger was this man who communicated primarily through silence, long, weighted pauses that most people rushed to fill with words they had not yet thought through. Elijah had read about this. He did not rush. When Bridger asked him what he was building Elijah did not give the answer of a man seeking investment. He gave the answer of a man describing a problem he had personally lived, how underserved logistics infrastructure in mid-tier southern cities was creating supply chain inefficiencies that cost regional manufacturers millions annually, and how a technology-integrated, community-rooted freight operation could solve that problem while generating returns that traditional logistics models were not capturing. Bridger listened. He asked 4 questions, each of which Elijah answered without hedging. At the end of 30 minutes, Bridger said 3 things: that the idea had merit, that execution would be the entire game, and that he would be willing to have a follow-up conversation if and when Elijah had a pilot project with measurable data. He did not write a check, but he did not close the door. And in the world of serious capital, that distinction matters enormously. The second meeting with Victor Osi happened differently, in a way that Elijah had not entirely anticipated. Victor met him not in an office, but at a construction site in South Atlanta, a mixed-use development. Victor was building in a neighborhood that had been economically neglected for 30 years. He handed Elijah a hard hat and walked him through the project while they talked, which Elijah understood immediately was a test of a different kind. Victor wanted to know how Elijah moved in a real space, whether he saw what needed to be seen, whether he asked the right questions or the impressive-sounding ones. They walked for 90 minutes. Victor talked about his early years in America, about the specific texture of building something with no margin for error, about the difference between people who understand communities and people who merely study them. Elijah talked about Southwest Atlanta, about watching his mother navigate a neighborhood that the city had made its decisions about before she ever arrived, about the logistics job and what he had learned about the geography of economic flow, where goods moved, where they stalled, where the infrastructure gaps created the invisible friction that kept certain communities in permanent economic slow motion. Victor stopped walking at one point and looked at Elijah directly. He said, "Raymond told me you had something. I want to see if he was right." And then he said something else, something that Elijah would carry with him for the rest of his life. The question is never whether you have the vision. Everyone has a vision. The question is whether you'll still be standing when the vision gets hard. Elijah said simply, "I've been standing through hard my whole life." Victor nodded. He said he would be in touch. He was within a week. The third meeting, with Franklin Marsh, was over breakfast at a hotel in Washington, D.C., and it was the most straightforward of the 3. Marsh was a pragmatist, a man who had spent decades in the space between government intention and private execution, and who had no patience for idealism untethered from operational reality. He wanted to know about regulatory environments, about Elijah's understanding of how municipal contracting worked, about whether Elijah had ever navigated a public process from the inside. Elijah was honest about the limits of his experience in that area. Marsh respected the honesty enough to spend 20 minutes after breakfast walking Elijah through the specific landscape of public-private freight and logistics, contracting in southern cities, explaining which relationships mattered, which political dynamics shaped infrastructure decisions, and where the genuine opportunity windows were opening in the next 18 months due to federal infrastructure funding that was about to flow into the region. It was 30 minutes of targeted intelligence that would have taken Elijah years to accumulate on his own. Marsh ended the breakfast by handing him a single business card, the card of the Memphis City Planning Commissioner, with a handwritten note on the back. "Tell him Franklin sent you." 3 meetings. No checks, no formal partnerships. But 3 doors, each opened precisely 1 crack by Raymond Calloway's name, and Elijah's own performance in the room. And 1 address in Memphis that was about to become the ground on which everything would either be built or lost. Because Victor Osi, true to his word, called Elijah exactly 6 days after their walk through the South Atlanta construction site. He proposed something that Elijah had not expected, and that required everything Elijah had to say yes to without hesitation. Victor had been tracking an opportunity in Memphis for 8 months, a commercial corridor in a historically black neighborhood on the south side of the city that had been designated for economic revitalization under a new city initiative. But that had stalled due to a combination of political friction, community distrust of outside developers, and the specific logistical complexity of building in a neighborhood with aging infrastructure and layered zoning complications. Victor had the capital. He had the development experience. What he did not have was someone who could navigate the community relationships with authenticity, manage the local contractor network with operational precision, and handle the logistics infrastructure planning that would determine whether the corridor actually functioned as an economic engine once built. He was offering Elijah that role, not as an employee, but as a co-developer with a 15% equity stake that would vest only upon project completion and only if the project hit specific performance benchmarks. If the project failed, Elijah received nothing. If it succeeded, 15% of the project's valuation at completion was his. Victor's internal estimate put completion value somewhere between $40 and $60 million. 15% of $60 million was $9 million. It was, by any measure, a life-changing number. It was also entirely contingent on Elijah doing something he had never done before at a scale he had never operated at, in a city where he had no existing relationships, under a timeline that allowed essentially no margin for error. Elijah said yes before Victor finished the sentence. He gave 2 weeks' notice at his logistics job the next morning. His supervisor, a decent man named Gary, who had always recognized that Elijah was operating well below his ceiling, shook his hand and said he hoped it worked out and that if it did not, his job would be here. Elijah thanked him and thought to himself that he could not afford to think about whether it would work out. He packed a bag, arranged for his mother's rent to be covered 3 months in advance from his savings, and drove to Memphis on a Wednesday in late March with a laptop, 2 boxes of files, the business card Franklin Marsh had handed him, and the index card from his bathroom mirror that he had carefully unpeeled and placed in his wallet. Never walk into a room asking. Always walk in with something to give. Memphis received him the way most cities receive people who arrive without a story anyone already knows, with complete indifference. He found a short-term, furnished apartment on the east side of the city, set up a workspace on the kitchen table, and began making calls. The first call was to the Memphis City Planning Commissioner, whose name was Dennis Hayward, using Franklin Marsh's card exactly as instructed. Hayward, it turned out, knew exactly who Victor Osi was and had been quietly hoping the stalled corridor project would find new momentum. He gave Elijah 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon and spent most of it explaining the political landscape with a frankness that Elijah found both refreshing and sobering. The corridor project had failed to gain community trust twice before under previous developers who had come in with plans already drawn and relationships they thought could be purchased. The neighborhood's residents had seen this pattern before and were, understandably, not interested in a third version of the same story. If Elijah and Victor wanted this to work, Hayward said, they would need to earn their way in, not buy it. Elijah nodded. He understood that particular language better than most. He spent the first 3 weeks in Memphis doing almost nothing that resembled what people typically think of as business development. He went to community meetings. He sat in on neighborhood association gatherings. He ate at the local restaurants and introduced himself not as a developer, but as someone who was trying to understand what the corridor could actually be for the people who live there. He listened more than he spoke, which is a skill that sounds simple and is extraordinarily difficult for people under pressure, and Elijah was absolutely under pressure. He called Raymond twice during those weeks, not for money but for counsel, and Raymond, who was now receiving treatment that had bought him a few additional months, answered both calls and said very little, but said it precisely. In one of those calls, Raymond told him something that Elijah would repeat many times in years to come. People who feel heard will follow you further than people you pay ever will. Elijah filed that away and kept showing up at the community meetings. By the 5th week, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single moment of breakthrough, but in the accumulating way that trust actually builds, one conversation at a time, one consistent appearance at a time, One honest acknowledgement of what you do not know at a time. A woman named Beverly, who had lived in the neighborhood for 42 years, and who served on the community board, with the specific authority of someone who had been right about outsiders enough times to have earned the room's complete deference, pulled Elijah aside after a meeting and told him that people were watching him and that they had not yet decided what they thought. He said he appreciated that. She said it was not a compliment. He said he knew. She almost smiled. 2 weeks later, she invited him to present the corridor plan to the full neighborhood association, which was a different kind of meeting entirely, larger, more formal, with microphones and a level of scrutiny that had ended the ambitions of the two previous development teams before they ever broke ground. Elijah prepared for that presentation for 4 days straight. He restructured the corridor plan to incorporate 23 specific requests and concerns he had collected from community conversations. He added a community benefits agreement that guaranteed local contractor hiring minimums, a small business incubator space within the corridor, and a community oversight board with genuine authority over design decisions. He did not present this as generosity. He presented it as the only logical framework for a project that needed to actually work for the people it was built around. The presentation took 90 minutes. The questions that followed took another 40. Beverly asked the hardest one. What happens to this plan when the money gets tight and the community benefits become inconvenient? Elijah looked at her directly and said, "You'll have it in writing with penalty clauses, and if it becomes inconvenient, that's when you hold us to it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "All right." It was not a standing ovation. It was not a celebration. It was 2 words from the most credible person in that room, and it was everything. But just as the project was finally gaining the traction it needed, something happened that Elijah had not seen coming, even though, in retrospect, he perhaps should have. His identity became public, not through Raymond's legal team, not through Victor, through a journalist at a Memphis business publication who had been tracking the corridor development story and who had, through a combination of public records research and a source Elijah would never fully identify, connected the name Elijah Cole to the name Raymond Calloway, and published a story under the headline, "Is the Calloway Corridor Deal a Dying Billionaire's Last Act of Atonement?" The article was not entirely inaccurate, which made it far more difficult to deal with than if it had been. It described Elijah as Raymond's illegitimate son, which was true. It described the disinheritance of the 3 legitimate Calloway children, which had apparently also leaked. And it raised the question, in the careful but pointed language of business journalism, of whether Elijah Cole was a genuinely independent operator or a proxy through which Raymond Calloway was attempting to rewrite his legacy at the expense of his other children. It was a damaging question. Not because it was entirely fair, but because it was precisely the kind of question that, once asked publicly, hangs in the air above every subsequent conversation like weather. The article ran on a Monday. By Wednesday, 2 institutional investors who had been in preliminary conversations with Victor about the project had sent emails requesting a pause while they, quote, assessed the reputational landscape of the development partnership. One of the local contractors Elijah had spent weeks cultivating called to say he was going to wait and see how things developed before signing his agreement. And Diane Calloway, back in Atlanta, gave an interview to a business media outlet in which she described her late awareness of Elijah's existence as, quote, one of many discoveries about my father's character that I am still processing, a statement carefully calibrated to be sympathetic to herself while planting exactly the right seed of doubt about both Raymond and Elijah in the mind of anyone reading it. Elijah read the interview on a Thursday morning in his Memphis apartment and sat with it for a long time. He thought about responding. He drafted 3 different responses in his head, each increasingly direct, each making the case he wanted to make. He deleted all of them, because what Raymond had said in that phone call was still sitting in the front of his mind. The question was never about what was fair. The question was always about what worked. He called Victor instead. Victor had already seen everything. He was quiet for a moment on the phone and then said, "So what do you want to do?" Elijah said, "I want to keep building." Victor said, "Then keep building." That was the entirety of that conversation. And the next morning, Elijah was back at the community meeting, sitting in the same folding chair he always sat in the same room that was his most important office, behaving exactly as he had before the article ran, because he had understood something fundamental about this moment. The community did not care about Raymond Calloway's reputation or Diane's interview or the institutional investors' emails. They cared about whether Elijah Cole was going to show up. And he was going to show up. The institutional investors did not come back. But something more important happened. Victor made the decision to move forward with his own capital, absorbing the risk that the institutional withdrawal had created. Because he had watched Elijah's response to the crisis and had seen exactly what he had been looking for since their walk through the South Atlanta construction site. He had seen someone who did not run toward the exits when the fire started. He had seen someone who, instead, checked to make sure the community was still in the building. That, Victor told Elijah in a later conversation, was the thing that no due diligence process could ever fully measure and that no amount of capital could ever fully replace. It was the difference between a developer and someone the community would actually let develop. And without that permission, given genuinely rather than extracted politically, no amount of money was ever going to make this corridor work. The project moved forward through the spring and into the summer with the specific grinding momentum of something that has survived its first real threat and emerged with its foundation intact. Elijah managed the local contractor relationships with an operational precision that consistently surprised people who had underestimated him, which was most people, and the community benefits agreement he had negotiated became, over time, something that Beverly and the Neighborhood Association cited not as a concession they had extracted, but as a framework they had helped build. That distinction, small as it might sound, was everything in a community context. It meant the project had advocates, not just spectators. And advocates, in the landscape of municipal development, are the difference between a project that clears its regulatory hurdles and one that gets stalled at every turn. Raymond's health, meanwhile, was declining on a timeline that was moving faster than his doctors had initially projected. By June, he had been admitted to the hospital twice for cardiac episodes, and though he was discharged both times, the trajectory was clear to everyone around him, including Raymond himself. He requested a visit from Elijah in late June, not through Patricia this time, but through a direct phone call that Raymond made himself, his voice quieter than Elijah had heard it, but still precise. Still the voice of a man who intended what he said and said only what he intended. Elijah drove to Atlanta on a Saturday morning and arrived at the hospital to find Raymond in a room that was private and simply furnished. A far cry from the mahogany study where this story had formally begun, but with the same quality of stillness that Raymond always seemed to generate in whatever space he occupied. He was sitting up, connected to monitors, looking out the window, with the expression of a man who is doing serious accounting of some kind, not financial but the other kind, the kind that arrives only when time has become undeniable. Elijah sat down in the chair beside the bed. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about the Memphis project, not about the will or the estate or the foundation, but about Raymond's actual life, about Renee, whom Raymond spoke of with a directness that felt like it had been held back for a long time, about the choices he had made and the reasoning behind them, and how that reasoning looked to him now from this particular vantage point, about Elijah's childhood, which Raymond asked about in a way that suggested he both wanted to know and was prepared to sit with the discomfort of what knowing would cost him. Elijah told him, not brutally, not with the specific intention to cause pain, but honestly, the way that honest people talk to each other when they have both decided that pretense is a luxury neither of them has time for anymore. Raymond listened. He did not defend himself. He said at one point simply, "I know." And then he said, "Your mother is a remarkable woman." I said that badly for too long. Elijah said nothing. He did not need to. The space Raymond's words occupied in that room was sufficient. What neither of them knew was that Preston was in the hallway. He had come to visit his father and had arrived outside the door to hear voices, had recognized Elijah's and had stood there in that corridor for a period of time he would later refuse to quantify, listening to a conversation that restructured everything he had thought he knew about his family, his father, and the man in that room he had spent 3 months dismissing as an interloper. Preston was not, at his core, a bad person. He was a person who had been sheltered from the specific kind of truth-telling that forces genuine self-examination. He was a man who had coasted, as people who can coast tend to do, right up until the moment when coasting was no longer an option, and who was now, standing in a hospital hallway, beginning to understand something about his own life that was deeply uncomfortable and, in its discomfort, possibly clarifying. He walked away from the door without going in. But something had shifted in him, and 3 days later, he made a phone call that changed the shape of what was coming. Not by giving Elijah anything material, not by reaching into any Calloway resource, but by calling Diane and telling her, directly and without preamble, to stop the media strategy, to stop whatever she was planning next. He did not frame it as morality. He framed it in terms she could understand. We already lost, Diane. The only thing we're deciding now is who we are while we lose. Diane did not respond warmly, but the interview requests she had been fielding stopped being returned, and the particular pressure that had been building on the Memphis project from that direction eased, not completely, but enough. The Memphis City Council vote was scheduled for a Thursday in August. Elijah had known this date for 6 weeks. The vote was on the final zoning approval for the corridor development, a proceeding that should have been straightforward, given the community support the project had built. But that had become complicated by a competing proposal backed by a development group with stronger political connections to 2 of the council's 7 members. The competing group had filed a challenge to the corridor's zoning application, arguing that the existing permits were insufficiently specific about traffic impact on a particular intersection that served a nearby residential block. The challenge was, in the assessment of most people who looked at it closely, a delay tactic rather than a substantive objection. But delay tactics in municipal development are not minor inconveniences. They are weapons. Every week the project was delayed cost money, eroded momentum, and gave opposition the time to find additional leverage. Elijah needed 3 council votes beyond the 2 he was confident he already had. He had been working on a third for weeks and believed he was close. But close, in the language of council chambers, is not the same as certain. 2 days before the vote, the situation became dramatically more complicated. A local television station ran a segment, clearly sourced from someone with access to the competing development group's research, that raised the traffic intersection concern in terms designed to alarm residents of the adjacent neighborhood, including in footage of the intersection at rush hour and interviews with 2 residents who expressed concern about the project's impact. The segment did not mention the community benefits agreement. It did not mention the 42 community meetings Elijah had attended. It presented the corridor project as an outside initiative, potentially at odds with the neighborhood it claimed to serve, which was not only inaccurate but was, to anyone who had actually been in those community meetings, a profound inversion of reality. Beverly saw the segment. She called Elijah within the hour. Her voice was controlled, but carried something underneath it that was close to fury. She said, "What do you need?" He said, "I need to talk to those 2 residents." She said, "I'll have them at my house in an hour." He spent that evening at Beverly's kitchen table, the same kind of table he had grown up around, talking with 2 people who had been given a distorted picture of something they had every right to be concerned about, and who, when presented with the actual facts, the actual community benefits agreement, the actual history of the project's development, the actual oversight structure that included them and their neighbors as genuine stakeholders rather than afterthoughts, shifted from concerned to engaged within 40 minutes. One of them, a retired school teacher named Arthur who had lived on his block for 31 years, asked Elijah a question directly. "Why should I trust that this is real and not the same thing we've been promised before?" Elijah looked at him and said, "Because I'm going to be the person you call if it isn't. Not a company, not an office. Me, you'll have my number." And if I don't answer, you call Beverly, and Beverly will find me." Arthur was quiet for a moment. He said, "All right." Elijah stayed until 10:30, drove back to his apartment, and did not sleep. He reviewed the zoning documents one more time. He read through the community benefits agreement clause by clause. He wrote a one-page summary of the traffic intersection plan that addressed the objection point by point in language that a council member who had not read the underlying documents could understand in 3 minutes. And then he sat in his apartment at 2 in the morning and thought about his mother, and about Raymond, and about that February study, and about whether the thing he was building was real enough to hold the weight of what it was meant to carry. The morning of the vote arrived gray and cool for August. Elijah was at City Hall by 7:30, 2 hours before the session began. He reviewed his materials in the hallway. He spoke with Dennis Hayward briefly. He did not speak to any council members directly, because the rules of the process did not allow it. And because Elijah had learned in these months that the most important conversations always happen before the formal ones, never during them. At 9 o'clock, the council chamber filled. The session was called to order. The competing development group's attorney presented their objection. Elijah's attorney responded. The council asked questions. Elijah, seated at the table beside his attorney, answered 3 of them directly when invited to do so, calmly and specifically, with the kind of precision that comes from having done the actual work rather than having been briefed on someone else's version of it. The chair called for discussion. 2 council members who had been identified as uncertain spoke. One of them said something that made the room go still for a moment. He said that in 20 years of council service, he had never seen a development project with this level of genuine community support that was also this technically sound, and that the traffic intersection objection, in his view, did not rise to the level that warranted blocking a project of this community benefit. The second member nodded. The chair called the vote, 5-2. The zoning was approved. The corridor project was cleared to proceed. Elijah sat for a moment before he stood up. He shook hands with his attorney. He nodded to Dennis Hayward across the room. He walked out of that chamber into the hallway where Beverly was waiting, because of course she was. She had been there since 8:30, and when he came through that door, she looked at him and said, "Well?" He said, 5-2. She made a sound that was not a word but was completely clear in its meaning. He thanked her. She waved the thanks away in the manner of someone who will not be receiving gratitude for doing what they clearly should have been doing all along. And then Elijah walked out of City Hall into the August morning and stood on the steps for a moment in the early light. And then he called his mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular texture of someone who had just finished a long shift and was running on the specific kind of tired that only certain kinds of work produce. He could not immediately find the words. She waited, because she had always known how to wait for him, how to hold the line open without filling it. And then he said, "Mom, I think I just became somebody." She did not scream. She did not immediately respond with the high emotion the moment might have invited. She went quiet for a long moment, a silence that contained decades of double shifts and kitchen table conversations and a love so consistent it had become the structural material of his entire life. And then quietly she said, "You were always somebody. I've been trying to tell you that your whole life." He stood on those City Hall steps for a while after the call ended. He did not immediately call Victor, though Victor would get the news within the hour and respond with the specific warmth of a man who had bet on the right person and knew it. He did not call Raymond, though he would visit him the following week, and Raymond would listen to the full account with the expression of a man receiving something he had hoped for but had not known, until this moment, whether he deserved to see. He stood on those steps and thought about what it actually felt like to have earned something, not been given it, not inherited it, not benefited from someone else's trajectory. Earned it with the specific currency of showing up, of being honest, of doing the actual work in the actual room, with the actual people who needed to be convinced not by money or by name, but by the quality of your character sustained under pressure over time. It felt, he would later tell his mother, like being introduced to yourself for the first time. The Memphis Corridor Project completed construction 14 months later, at a final valuation of $74 million. Elijah's 15% equity stake made him a multimillionaire before his 31st birthday. The community benefits agreement was executed in full. 43% of contractor hours went to local businesses. The small business incubator opened with 11 founding tenants, and the Community Oversight Board held its first meeting 6 weeks before the ribbon cutting. Beverly was elected chair of that board. She has not missed a meeting since. Raymond Calloway died in October, 11 months after that February morning in his study. He did not live to see the corridor completed, but he lived long enough to know it would be. In his final weeks, he amended not the will but a private letter, read at a small gathering of the people who had actually known him, a gathering that included Elijah and Renee, who attended together, and that did not include Diane, who declined, or Carter, who sent a brief note of respect, or Preston, who came, stood in the back of the room, and did not speak but stayed until the very end. In that letter, Raymond acknowledged Elijah as his son. He described the Memphis project as the only thing with his name on it, however indirectly, that had made him proud in the way that the things you actually sacrifice for make you proud, as opposed to the things you simply finance. He ended the letter, which was read aloud by Patricia, in the same precise tone she had used to deliver everything she ever delivered for Raymond, with a single line addressed to Elijah directly. It said, "You didn't waste it." The charitable foundation received the Calloway estate as planned. Diane's interior design firm continued under its own weight, which meant it continued to struggle. Preston took a position at a mid-sized logistics company in Charlotte, a real one, at a level appropriate to his actual experience, and by several accounts has been doing something resembling genuine work for the first time in his professional life, which is its own kind of beginning. Carter moved to a smaller city in the Pacific Northwest, and, by his own telling in a brief interview he gave a year later, is finding something like clarity in the specific relief of no longer being the heir to an expectation he never wanted. Whether that constitutes it a good outcome depends entirely on what you think a good outcome looks like for someone who was given everything and found it insufficient. There is no clean moral there. There is only a life continuing in whatever direction it chooses. Elijah Cole has not given many interviews. He is not, by nature, a man who needs the world to watch him work. He has a second project underway in Birmingham, a third in the planning stages in Jackson, Mississippi. Victor Ossie remains his development partner. Thomas Bridger's fund made a commitment to the Birmingham project after reviewing the Memphis results, which were exactly what Elijah had described they would be in that private club in New York 3 years earlier. Franklin Marsh sent a handwritten note after the Memphis ribbon cutting. It said, "Dennis Hayward told me you were the real thing. I'm glad Raymond knew it first." Elijah still has that card. It is in his wallet, next to an index card that has been refolded so many times the creases are soft. The index card still says, in handwriting that is not his, "Never walk into a room asking. Always walk in with something to give." His mother still works, not because she has to, because she says she does not yet know who she is in the morning if she is not moving towards something. Elijah has tried to change this. He will probably keep trying. She will probably keep going to work. This is the specific negotiation of people who love each other across the distance of different relationships with effort. And it is ongoing, and it is fine. There is a photograph that exists, taken by someone at City Hall on the morning of the zoning vote. It was not taken with any particular intention. It was a phone photograph shot by a young woman who was interning in the planning department and who later described taking it simply because the man in the shot had a look on his face that she wanted to remember. The photograph shows Elijah from behind, standing on the steps of Memphis City Hall, phone to his ear, looking out at an ordinary August street. His posture is the posture of someone who has just been handed something and is still in the process of understanding its weight. It is not a triumphant image. It is something better than that. It is an honest one. That photograph is currently hanging in the small conference room of Elijah Cole's development company, which is headquartered in a building he owns in South Atlanta. 4 miles from the apartment where Renee Cole worked double shifts, so her son could go to a decent school and know that his existence was not a mistake. The building was purchased at market rate. The conference room table was second-hand. The walls are mostly bare except for that photograph, one framed index card, and a letter in Raymond Calloway's handwriting that has been mounted in glass. Not because the man was perfect, not because the story is simple, but because the letter is the beginning of this story. And Elijah's decided that knowing where things begin is worth more than pretending they started somewhere cleaner. On the desk in his office, in the top right drawer, there is one more item. A single cracked leather wallet that belonged to Raymond Calloway, given to Elijah by Patricia after the funeral, along with a note that said simply that Raymond had wanted him to have it. Inside the wallet there was nothing. No money, no cards, nothing at all. Just the wallet itself, old and worn and built to last. The kind of thing a man carries for 50 years because he is not in the habit of throwing away the things that have held everything he needed. Elijah keeps it empty. He says it reminds him what the starting line actually looks like. And every morning when he goes to work, which is every morning, he puts his own wallet in his own pocket and goes to build something that did not exist before he arrived. That is the story, not of an inheritance received, but of one created. Not of a father's gift, but of a son's answer to a question that was asked too late and answered exactly on time. Raymond Calloway built $4 billion from $32 and a broken truck and a stubbornness that other people called faith. Elijah Cole built something from 3 phone numbers, a handwritten letter, and a life that had been teaching him, from the very beginning, exactly what he would need to know when the moment finally came. The moment came. He was ready. And now in a building he owns, in a city he grew up watching from the outside, the story continues. The way all real stories do, not with an ending, but with a man at a desk, doing the work, and a door that opens every morning because someone made sure it would. And that is where we will leave Elijah Cole today. Not at a finish line, because people who are built the way he is built do not think in finish lines. At a desk, at the work, with everything he earned and nothing he did not. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what you are building and what you were given, and what those two things have to do with each other, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And before you go, let us know where in the world you are watching from. Every comment, every subscriber, every person who stays until the end of one of these stories. That is what makes it possible to keep telling them. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next one.